don't need to remind me to record,
Thank you.
because because I promised lots of people that I would record this. So I am gonna put you on mute while I'm gonna do a bit of the presentation. You can unmute yourself, if you have a question, and do feel free to interrupt me. Um, it's easier in terms of feedback if I've pressed the mute button at least once. Um, so that we can all hear each other. Um, it's lovely to see you all. Really, really lovely, and wonderful to have Rabbi Renee Pfurzel with us as well and his congregants. It's really, really fantastic. And I hope all those who had the opportunity to be there last week enjoyed last week's lecture, which was really a spectacular introduction, to sort of the unearthing the story of the Cairo Genizah. Um, and if you missed it and you want to catch up on it, it really was a very entertaining hour, I thought also. Um, then I had recorded it, so and it's available via a quick link on YouTube, but you do need the link in order to find it. You can't just search for it. So if you do want to watch it, then just let me know, and we can watch you can watch it in your own time again. I almost watched it again. I had such fun last time. I almost watched it again. Um, so I am going to share my screen with you. Um, and hopefully I will still be able to see you. So today what we're going to look at is a little bit unearthing the evolution of Jewish prayer. Now, it's a little bit difficult to. I kind of fell into a bit of a rabbit hole of Cairo Genizah texts as I was preparing for the session, which is really a fantastic thing, a real privilege. But what we're going to do is we're going to look a little bit at liturgical aspects, and what we've discovered through the Cairo Genizah. Now, interestingly, we talked about how many fragments there are in the Cairo Genizah, and the estimates are somewhere between 200 and 400,000 fragments. Part of the reason why it's such a um, hugely different estimate is also that sometimes they don't they disagree whether it's one fragment or two fragments. How much does it still have to be hanging on the same thread to be counted as two separate ones? um, Interestingly, there are probably only about 10,000 liturgical fragments, which is actually quite surprising because you would have thought that a lot of the material is liturgical, right? That actually, because if we think about a Geniza these days, most of the donations are prayer books. So, in a sense, it's surprising that there are only about 10,000 liturgical fragments. On the other hand, when you spend a little bit longer thinking about it, um, you of course realize that probably prayer books were quite rare, right? Unlike today, where kind of every person would have had their prayer book, in those days, probably maybe the community had one prayer book, or maybe each of the service leaders had one prayer book, but certainly not every person attending a service would have had a prayer book. So that explains why there are not as many fragments which have liturgical text on it. So we have about 10,000 liturgical fragments that were identified so far. When we say liturgical fragments, what are we talking about? Passages from the prayer book, but also, and we'll look at this today. I hadn't initially planned on it, but then I fell into this rabbit hole. Also Haggadot, and I thought, actually, why? How could we not look at Pesach um, if we are looking, if we're so close to Pesach? Haggadot. The other things that are considered liturgical are ketubot, so marriage certificates. We're not going to look at those in this session, um, and so those are liturgical texts. They are still working on many of the fragments. Many of the fragments have not yet been identified. and there might be many, many more than these 10,000 that have been so far identified. Now, most of the texts that were found in the Geniza that have liturgical content follow what's known as the Babylonian rite. The Babylonian rite is the rite that you are familiar with these days, right? And again, it's not so surprising. Babylonia became the heart of Jewish scholarship, the heart where the Jewish community lived after the destruction of the Second Temple. And it's the place where probably the first prayer books were written. So the first prayer book that we used to be familiar with, Seder Rav Amram in the Geonic period. So the Geonic period is the period straight after the rabbis of the Talmud. So between the 6th and the 9th century, it's normally 10th century is the Geonic period. And they have the Babylonian rite, which is basically what contemporary prayer books are based on. And there isn't really a great deal there aren't a great number of prayer books that are based on the rite of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, the Palestinian rite. We will see though an example here. We will see an example here, and the primary importance really of the Geniza lies in the fragments that reflect the prayer customs of the Jews of the land of Israel. So this Eretz Yisrael tradition, which was basically extinct until the Cairo Genizah was uncovered, because they just didn't, maybe they weren't as wealthy, but certainly weren't as popular, and their books kind of got lost. Sometimes there were traces that remained because they were quoted in other books, but we didn't have a full prayer book following the Palestinian rite. So this is really of great importance, and the Jewish community in Israel really at the end of the first millennium it starts to die out. So and become very small and not really a center of creativity. So what we will look at, what I thought we'll look at for a large chunk of this session is the example of the mystery of the Shmoneh Esrei prayer, because this is really one of the things that the Cairo Genizah managed to solve, a mystery of thousands of years in Jewish liturgy. Now, the Shmoneh Esrei... Sorry, John, did you have a question? Sorry, you're on mute?
I had a question.
No, sorry. There, I didn't have a question. I was just moving about. I beg your pardon. I didn't realize you could see me.
I can see you.
Yeah,
but David has a question.
I'll mute myself.
Well, I'm happy to share my question with John. When we talk about prayer books, there, where we probably all think about blue-covered books, but Gutenberg was born in 1400 and was printing in the 1450s, and the Genizah prayer books must be almost all 200-300 years before that, if not older. So were these handwritten, stitched books of parchment, or were they scrolls? Because they couldn't possibly have been printed books.
So they're definitely not printed books. So we will look at some examples. I have a few fragments for us. So paper starts becoming much more popular. So a lot of them are actually already on paper. They're not on parchment, so not vellum, but they are on a sort of paper or types of paper. And we will see that there are different types. So there are some that are basically hand stitched like folios. So they would have been like books that you can fold up. were scrolls, often then only fragments. There are lots of loose leaf collections also, where we can, normally the way you can tell whether something was a stitch to get a book or a loose leaf is if you look what the page over is, right? Because when you have a book, then the facing pages don't normally follow the next text along. I'll show it to you on the example. You'll recognize, you'll see it there. So we get a combination of them, but we don't we don't have, I don't believe we have any printed books in the Cairo Genizah. The Cairo Genizah was no longer in use there. So yes, so it's handwritten. It's handwritten books, some stitched books, some loose leaf collections, some scrolls, and what we'll also see a lot of the time. I just have one example of that. A lot of the time, papers were reused. So where one side of the page is something altogether different to on the other side. And it's an interesting question, kind of what went on what. Like, would they have written the... We'll get to it in a moment, but because it's really, there's a really cool example of a Haggadah, which has on the back a completely different text. So you'll see, there's a variety there. So we're going to look at I thought the mystery of the Shmoneh Esrei as one kind of case study of what can we learn in terms of liturgical knowledge from the Cairo Genizah, which was really a mystery that rabbis, even in the times of the Talmud, we'll see, were wondering about. Now, the great thing about the Shmoneh Esrei example is that you're very familiar with the text, right? The Shmoneh Esrei, it's an alternative name for the Amidah or Hatfilah, the standing prayer. Now, Shmoneh Esrei literally means 18. But the Babylonian rite, which is what we have inherited, the Amidah has 19, not 18 blessings. We're going to look at what the blessings are in just a moment. So the great mystery was, where did the extra blessing come from, right? How can it be? How can it be called the 18 prayer, but it has 19 prayers? So let's start by looking at what the Babylonian rite consists of. Now, most of you will be very familiar with the first three blessings, right? Because they are also found on Shabbat and festivals. So it begins with the prayer Avot, right? Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. In our case, the Imahot are included as well. Then we have Gvura, meaning might or miracles, right? That's where we have Mechayei Hametim. So oftentimes nowadays you'll find it translated as might. Professor Reif, who used to be the head of he's just retired, who used to be the head of the Genizah research at Cambridge University, he says the translation of might is not right. It means miracles. And he says it's very clear if you look at the Chanukah liturgy, it uses Gvura. In Al-Hanisim, it's really about miracles. And that's why the Mechayei Hametim, bringing the dead back to life, that's why that fits. It's not just about God's might, but it's about God doing miracles, things that we can't imagine being possible. So that's the Gvura. And then Kedusha, right? God's holiness. We find those in the weekday and Shabbat and festival Amidah. Then you'll also be familiar with the last three blessings. Again, they are the same for weekday and Shabbat and festivals. Avodah, that's the one that starts with Retzeh, Adonai Eloheinu. Then Hoda'a, Modim Anachnu Lach, right? And Sim Shalom or Shalom Rav, the prayer for peace. Those are the last three blessings. On Shabbat or festival, we only have one middle blessing, right? We only have one middle blessing, which is the blessing, the holiness of the day. That's where we have it's split into several sections, so it looks as if it's a bit more substantial, but it's really just one blessing, which is about either about Shabbat or about the festival. But on the weekday, we get in the Babylonian rite, we have 13 blessings in the middle, right? We have a blessing about Binah, understanding, Tshuva, return or repentance, Slicha, forgiveness, Geulah, redemption, Refuah, healing, Birkat Hashanim, blessing for years, really agricultural productivity, Galuyot, the ingathering of the exiles, praying for the ingathering of the exiles, Birkat Hadin, a prayer for justice, Birkat Haminim, the prayer against the heretics. We'll come back to that one. Tzadikim, al-Hatzadikim, this is about the righteous, but also very important in all versions. There's a lot of variety in this blessing, in the different fragments that are found, but they all include the righteous converts, which is an interesting thing, that you have a blessing of the converts. The Gerim HaTzedek, the righteous converts. And then you have the blessing Bonei Yerushalayim, the builders of Jerusalem, Birkat David, the blessing on David or the Davidic dynasty in terms of the Messiah in traditional liturgy, and Shomer Tfilah, God who listens to our prayer, right? So we find in the Babylonian rite that there are 19 blessings. When did the text get fixed? Well, from all the different fragments, not just from the Cairo Genizah, but from all other things that we found, we know that the text probably goes back to the 1st century, but probably there wasn't a single official version of the Amidah until at the very least the 2nd century, and probably much later. And we'll see in the Genizah that there were many different versions found of some of the blessings. The similarity that is found in the fragments suggests that the first 3 blessings and the final lines of the middle blessings had a relatively fixed form. And what you find on some of these manuscripts actually is that it was so clear that it was fixed that they didn't even give the whole text. They just gave like a few letters abbreviation, because they assumed, you didn't need to write out all the text again, because you knew the text anyway. So what we have is probably the first 3 blessings are quite old, and they're also recorded in the Babylonian Talmud, for example. And then the final line of the blessing, so Baruch atah Adonai Rofeh HaCholim, for example, like he who heals, the healer of the sick, and so on. So these seem to be fairly fixed. Very interestingly, the final 3 blessings were the least fixed. So that's our Retzeh, our Modim Anachnu Lach, and our Sim Shalom, right? Again, not so surprising. Even we know 2 different versions of the prayer for peace, Sim Shalom and Shalom Rav. There were so many versions probably that were popular that they decided that they couldn't just settle on one. So they allocated to different services different versions of the same blessing, rather than having to decide on one version when they put the prayer books together. And what also seems to be quite clear is that the order, and what we'll see is even the number of the middle blessings, was flexible. So probably whoever led the prayers, when there was about a drought about to happen, they might want to emphasize the prayer for agricultural benefit and move it a bit further to the front, right? Or maybe a community was suffering from the plague or some other illness, and the prayer for healing was more important. So people rearranged them, it seemed. Now, as said, in the some of these texts are already recorded in the Talmud. Now, we find in the Talmud in the Babylonian Talmud in Brachot, we find Rabban Gamliel saying, each and every day a person b'chol yom v'yom mitpalel adam shmone esre. Each and every day, a person recites the prayer of 18 blessings. There's a debate, is this Rabban Gamliel the first or Rabban Gamliel the second? And that's a little bit a question about dating. We'll come to when Rabban Gamliel lived. But it seems, and this is already in the Mishnah. This is the Mishnah quoting. You'll recognize that this is the Mishnah because it's in Hebrew. The Gemara, the Talmudic parts tend to be in Aramaic. This is when my reading gets much worse. So the Gemara then, so the Aramaic now in response asks, Hane tamne srei chasere havayan. So what does it say? In Hebrew this would be Hine shmone esre, behold the shmone esre, but there are 19, right? So already the Talmud is stuck with this question. The Talmud has inherited from the Mishnah. There are 18 blessings, right? Still Eretz Yisrael ritual from Rabban Gamliel. But they already know 19. What is going on, right? So already the Talmud is asking. What the Talmud thinks is that we're talking about Rabban Gamliel II. Rabban Gamliel II lived about 80 to 120 Common Era. What's going on in Eretz Yisrael around 80 to 120 Common Era? What is on the rise? Christianity, right? So Christianity is on the rise. Now, so what does the Talmud think? There must have been a new blessing because they're responding to Christianity being around. So what is the theory of the Talmud? The theory of the Talmud is that Birkat HaMinim, this blessing against the heretics, is added. And they say, Tanu Ramanan, the sages taught, Shimon HaPakuli arranged the 18 blessings before Rabban Gamliel in order in Yavne. So Shimon HaPakuli came along and he went to Rabban Gamliel in Yavne and he said, these are the 18 blessings that we should have. And then Rabban Gamliel responds to the sages and says, we now need a new blessing. Is there any person who knows how to institute the blessing of the heretics? We need a new blessing, the blessing of the heretics. And Shmuel HaKatan, Shmuel the little one, who apparently is in the Talmud especially pious, stands up and establishes this blessing. Now, very, very interestingly, the Talmud then goes on that in the second year afterwards, the next time round, Shmuel HaKatan even forgot the blessing for the heretics. So, and then they're wondering maybe he's a heretic because he doesn't want to say the blessing suddenly. Because the blessing for the heretics is, talks about the ones that, and this is what we have preserved here in the Ashkenazi liturgy, and it's the same in the Sephardi liturgy actually, is like the Malshinim are the apostates, right? So the Jews that are no longer part of it. So we have, and we have a different version in progressive liturgies because progressive liturgies were a little bit anxious about this blessing against the heretics. But in traditional prayer books that follow the Ashkenazi or Sephardi liturgy, we have this blessing against heretics. Let there be no hope for the apostates. And may all the wicked ones instantly perish. May all the enemies of your people be swiftly cut off. And may you quickly uproot, crush, rout, and subdue the insolent speedily in our days. Blessed are you, Adonai, crusher of enemies and subduer of the insolent. Not the nicest blessing. No surprise, really, that the progressives decided to challenge it. Now, the passage that I've highlighted here is just because we'll see here, this section we'll see is a little bit different in the fragment in the Genizah, right? So let's keep in mind what we're trying to do is the Talmud right? The Talmud says there are 19 blessings because this is the new blessing. This is what Jews believed from the times of the Talmud, so that's 5th to 7th century, sometime around that. Actually, already starting in the times of the Mishnah, so from the 1st century, until Solomon Schechter comes along in 1898. And this is actually one of the first publications that comes out of the Genizah. In 1898, Solomon Schechter, along with Israel Abrahams, publishes a 9th to 10th century manuscript with a version of the Hebrew prayer of the Amidah, recovered from the Cairo Genizah, where there are only 18 blessings, but the Birkat Haminim is there. Talmud was wrong. So the Birkat Haminim is there. Now, interestingly, not only is there one Birkat Haminim, no, we find 86 manuscripts that follow the Palestinian rite, and they contain 6 different versions of the Birkat Haminim. So actually, it's very clear it was not new. Even in Eretz Yisrael, they had already the Birkat Haminim. Now, let's look at this manuscript. It's a beautiful, beautiful manuscript. So you can see here, this very clearly looks like it was a book stitched together by hands, right? You can even sort of see where it was probably stitched. And you can see, but interestingly, this is the middle page. So the text goes from here to here, runs on. Now, I've given you the text here. This is the blessing of the apostates for the Birkat Haminim. It starts in the Hebrew down at the bottom, right? Lameshumadim, right? For the apostates. Al tihiyeh tikva. It's quite difficult to read it here. Umalchut Sadon, right? You can sort of see Sadon, Mehera, Te'akir Beyameinu, and then it's very difficult to read, but probably Vehanotzrim, Vehaminim, Karega Ya'avdu. So what the text here says is, for the apostates let there be no hope, and may the kingdom of the arrogant be quickly uprooted in our days, right? That's the Malchut Sedon. And may the Nazarim, or the Christians, Notzrim is a term for the Christians. The sect of the Nazarenes was an early Christian sect, and Augustus talks about the terminology and says when the Jews talk about the Notzrim, they mean all Christians. They don't just mean the small sect. And it's always it's always good when you have an external source to confirm, right? So Augustus a Christian source talks about how the Jews talk about the Christians. Very interesting. And certainly we find in Talmud this language of Notzrim when we're talking about the Christian. So it seems already in the Eretz Israel, right? We have this blessing against the heretics, the Minim, and the Notzrim. And we see the text that is underlined is basically the text that is the same these days. And then there's a little bit of difference. Interestingly, they shall instantly perish, but they shall be blotted from the book of the living, right? Interesting cross-reference that from the high holidays, and not be written with the righteous. So that recalls that imagery of the two books that God opens. And then it ends with, "Blessed are you, eternal one, humbler of the arrogant." So this is our first blessing. This is the end, right? Baruch atah Adonai. So interestingly, you can already see in these early versions of the prayer book the use of Yod Yod for Adonai. Very, very early. Beautiful manuscript, really beautifully preserved, right? Actually, really surprisingly legible. Now, so what's going on? So Birkat HaMinim is not the new blessing, but what's happened? Why do we only have 18 and not 19? Well, if we go to the next, not quite the next blessing, the next blessing, right, would have been Al Gerei HaTzedek. That's the righteous converts. But the one after that, Rachem Adonai Eloheinu Berachamecha Harabim, right? Al Yisrael Amecha V'al Yerushalayim Irecha V'al Tzion Mishkan Kevodecha V'al Heichalach, and so on. Now let's look at the English here. What is our blessing here? Have compassion with your great compassion upon Israel your people, upon Jerusalem your city, upon Zion the dwelling place of your honor, upon your temple, upon your residence, upon the royal house of David. If you think back to the two blessings, to the list of the 13 blessings, in the Babylonian rite, we have a separate blessing for building Jerusalem and for David, right? Here we have one blessing together. And if we look at, so these are the versions that you get today in a prayer book. You would have, "And to Jerusalem your city return in mercy, and dwell therein as you have spoken, and rebuild it soon," right? Very clearly language of after the destruction of the temple, right? Temple is destroyed. We hope that the temple will be rebuilt. And then you have a blessing on David, your servant, that he may flourish and exalt his power with your deliverance, and so on. So what has happened? Clearly, the wording of the blessing number 14 changed dramatically between the earliest Palestinian version and the earliest Babylonian one. The main difference is that the Palestinian version appears to be a benediction for Jerusalem with a benediction concerning David slotted in, right? David is just a little insert, while the Babylonian version is solely about Jerusalem and adds a separate benediction for David. What scholars say is even more significant is the Palestinian version assumes that the temple is still standing, right? Fascinating. So now think about when this prayer must have been formulated. The temple is still standing, so it must be before 70 Common Era, right? But Christianity is already on the rise because they are referring to the Notzrim. So we are starting to see really very, very clearly of dating when this prayer must have been formulated. Absolutely fascinating. Now, what do scholars think? Why did the Babylonian rite insert a separate benediction for David? What scholars think, although there is no clear evidence, because people didn't write down why did I this is the reason why we added this. So it's very difficult sometimes to guess. But what modern scholars say is the most likely reason for why the Babylonian rite separated Jerusalem and the Davidic dynasty was that in Babylonia there was a kind of like a role in the community for the descendant of David. So they had kind of like a House of Lords type role, which was hereditary for and they were kind of pitched against the Geonim, and therefore for the Babylonians, David and the Davidic dynasty wasn't just associated with David the Messiah or the predecessor of the Messiah and the temple, but it was actually really identified with the Davidic dynasty, which was still active, and therefore that it didn't make sense to have a joint blessing because the temple was destroyed, but the Davidic dynasty was intact. So for them it didn't make sense. So probably they added the blessing for David. Interestingly, they must have forgotten that very quickly, because by the time the Talmud comes around, they've already forgotten, right? So 5th century, they've already forgotten, or they wanted us to forget. Possibility too. They did not want that tradition to be preserved. But it is really fascinating. So if we can see the comparison side by side again, that we see, in the Palestinian version, it says, have compassion, right? Not return your compassion, right? It assumes there is still a temple, because it's upon your dwelling place, upon Jerusalem, whereas here it's about the Babylonian version, and when it says Amram, that's Sidur Rav Amram. It's one of the it's the oldest Sidur that we have found, and it follows the Babylonian rite. So fascinating story. Without the Cairo Genizah, we would have never found out. Everyone would have just believed the Talmud. But now we have quite a lot of solid evidence that it was not the blessing against the heretics that was inserted, but in fact the Davidic dynasty was an insertion in the Babylonian time. So we're going to leave the Amidah behind. If there are any questions before we move on from the Amidah, then this is probably a good point to ask questions. Otherwise, we can come back to it also. But if you do have a question now, this is a good point in time. I can't see anyone waving at me. Fantastic. Now, David, very good.
Well, no, it's just an observation rather than a question, because as I recall, by the year 100, certainly at the turn of the 1st century, when the Christian Gospels were being formulated, the Davidic theme was important to their emerging theology. And I wonder whether there's a sensitivity about that on the Jewish side of the fence. They would have known about the importance of the lineage back to David that was claimed for Christ.
Yes, probably. And I mean, I'm not an expert on kind of the Babylonian interaction with early Christian, because it's sort of the Palestinian rite would have been most influenced rather than the Babylonian immediately. But probably, so it's none of this is unrelated, and we know for a fact that the Babylonian scholars had a very regular exchange with the Palestinian scholars during the whole Geonic period, for example. So as late as the Geonic period, and this is even earlier, of course, we see that there is a lively debate who wins the halachic argument. So for example, about how you determine the calendar. The Babylonians win against the Palestinians in the end, but those sort of things. So we know there must have been an influence, a cross influence, absolutely, and we can see with the prayer against the heretics, right? They are responding to that. We're gonna skip. We're gonna do a little jump to a totally different passage, also from a Siddur. This is a Siddur that was found again. You can see it's on paper. It was probably folded. It's double-sided. You see, there are no vowels here in the Siddur. It's primarily in Hebrew because it's a Siddur, but it has a few comments in Judeo-Arabic, and if you find the ones that are in Judeo-Arabic, you win the prize. I've been trying to sort of look through it and see if I can figure it out, but I couldn't quite. But what the reason why I wanted to show this is that it's very interesting. Many people will assume that in the before the Micha Mocha, in progressive liturgies we often include Moshe u'Miriam u'Venei Yisrael, and many people assume that the Miriam is a very late insert by progressives. Now, this is probably from as early as the 6th century, this manuscript. And we see Sham Shira Sharu Lecha Moshe ve'Aaron u'Miriam. Right? Already in those days, Miriam was included in the singing. Also Aaron was included. So there's no version. There's actually 3 different fragments that have Moshe ve'Aaron u'Miriam. So actually it's not so new. It wasn't just us progressives. If you're looking at this, you will see that in this prayer book they're trying to keep it short. So instead of giving us the full Shema, they just say Shema ve'Gomel, Shema, etc. Right? They don't need to tell you anything. They don't even go as Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu. They just go Shema, etc. And then Emet, etc. Right? Those are just assumed that we all know. Also, just out of interest, so you see a little bit of what's on this page, right? We have Ashrei Yoshvei Veitecha Ot Yehalelu Chasela, Ashrei Ha'am Shekacha Lo, Ashrei Ha'am She'Adonai Elohav, Tehillah LeDavid. Right, so that's the Ashrei, or Bachi Nafshi Et Adonai, also one of the Psalms. And this is where we see that this really was a prayer book that was folded, because it doesn't go from here to, because this is Ahavat Olam, and it doesn't kind of continue. So there would have been a different page. It would go to a different page because it would have gone to another page in the book. It fell apart at the seam. We unfortunately only have this one sheet, which is a double-sided sheet. I haven't given you the second side, but it's a beautiful, beautifully clear passage of and it has on the other side, it also has a little bit of Birkat Hamazon. So if you want to look it up, it's TSK 2717. The Cambridge University Genizah Digital Archives is fantastic. So you just Google and all these things kind of just pop up. But really fascinating. So this might be as early as the 6th century that we see the insertion of Miriam here. Now, the next thing, we're going to move on to Haggadot. Now, this is an example of a Haggadah, and what you can't see, I should have maybe done, is it's a really long piece of text. Like, it's long and thin. It was probably rolled, possibly hung, we don't know. But what's absolutely fascinating is you see in the text of the Haggadah is with vowels, and if you look carefully, you can see ha lachma anya, just the same text as in our Haggadah here, slightly different vowel pattern to the Aramaic, but you get ha lachma anya, and then instead of di achalu, it's da achalu, right? Avhatna ba'ara de Mitzrayim. The tzadi is a bit funny, the Mitzrayim, and so on. And it goes through the whole halachma anya, and then it goes to ma nishtana halayla hazeh. And interestingly, slightly different order of the text. It starts what in our 4 questions, right? We start with the chametz umatzah. This one starts with the dipping that we anachnu chayavim, we are anu chayavim. We are ein anu chayavim. We are not obliged to dip afilu pa'am echad, not even once. That's what we're normally not. But v'halayla hazeh, but this night shtei pa'amim, right? And this time we dip twice. Then it goes shebechol halelot anu ochlin chametz umatzah. That we know normally as our first verse. So slightly different order. Now, fantastic, right? What's the date of this? Interesting question. A lot of the times they're really struggling with dating this. In this case, our advantage is, and what you see is when it doesn't have vowels, it gives stage instructions in Judeo-Arabic. So it says, and the youngest shall sing the following questions. But it says that in Arabic. So when it doesn't have vowels and it still looks like Hebrew, but there are no vowels, then it's in Judeo-Arabic. Now, how do we date this? Conveniently on the back, if you look, this is the back, so it's also upside down. If you look at the hole in the parchment, you can see how it kind of matches up. This Haggadah was written, presumably the ordinary text was there before, right? It also looks much more smushed out than the Haggadah. The Haggadah looks newer. It was written on the back of a letter, and the letter describes a communal argument with the uprising of the local cobblers in Alexandria in the 11th century. So we know that this Haggadah must be sometime after this local uprising in Alexandria of the local cobblers. And they send a letter. And then, you know, what you do when you have a long piece of paper that's precious, you reuse it to write your Haggadah. Really, and just love it. I think it's just so fabulous. And really, really beautifully written. I mean, it takes a little bit of time to try and decipher it, but it's actually really surprisingly clear. And I wanted to give you a bit of an impression of it, so I haven't super zoomed in on it, but to give you a bit of an overall impression. We also get Passover Haggadot, different types of Passover Haggadot. So this is a little bit later. We're not quite sure that you can see the time window is quite wide, 10th to 16th century. Here you can see, what do we have here? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei pri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bacha banu mikol am, v'romamanu b'chol lashon, right? It's our kiddush. So we have the kiddush here. Who would write the text? So it's an interesting question, who would write the text, whether it was, so probably when it was very neat, it was probably professional scribes, but it might have been with the Haggadot, for example, with the letter, one suggestion is that people would copy out the text for home use. So they would come with their piece of paper and they would copy it out. If it's nicely written, if you, just on the Cambridge side alone, if you search for Haggadah, there are over 560 fragments with text from the Haggadah. And what's interesting here is also that we have Judeo-Arabic on the other side. Again, right, we see the Hebrew text has vowels, and then the Judeo-Arabic does not have vowels, and it has a bit more explanations. It switches a lot between Hebrew and Arabic, which makes it a bit tricky to read. I gave you the next page of it just because it's quite nice. So you can always see that it's on one side is the unvocalized, and on the other one it's the vocalized blessings here. And I think, and I have one more fragment which is even older. This is on parchment. They think it's probably the 5th century, and it's also, you can see Baruch atah, it's Borei Pri Hagafen. It's also a section from a Haggadah, and interestingly here, it doesn't have Judeo-Arabic as the alternative language, but it has Aramaic, right? You get Chad v'Chad. You get some Aramaic in there. So lots of fascinating manuscripts that we have in this collection. I am going to end my screen share so that people can ask questions, and I hopefully will be able to answer them. And if people want to have the presentation, I'm very happy to share it afterwards. Any questions or comments or thoughts?
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Tell me, how would you tell the difference in the Haggadah between Judeo-Aramaic and, not Hebrew,
Aramaic?
Yeah.
So you can't buy the script, so you need to understand the language.
All right.
And so I mean, probably most scholars did it the same method that most rabbis did. When do you see that the text in the Talmud swaps from Hebrew to Aramaic? When you stop understanding what's going on.
Right. Thank you.
Now it's much more difficult for an amateur like me, right? Because my Aramaic is also pretty lousy by now. It was never very good, to be honest, but it's really pretty lousy by now. And there are some words in Aramaic and Arabic that are quite similar, and my Arabic is even worse than my Aramaic. Unfortunately, the theory of when I stop understanding doesn't really work because it just means that it's likely not to be Hebrew. Um, Very conveniently for the amateur like me, the Cambridge University website has helpfully tells you which languages are on the found on the fragment. So scholars have spent time looking at it. So yeah, so you can't tell it by the script. Normally, with what you often see is this differentiation that when it's Hebrew, it's with vowels, and when it's another language, it's not. But not always. We saw the whole prayer book without vowels, for example.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes.
Sybil and then Renee, I think.
Yes.
Sorry, Rabbi
I
Renee.
did send you a chat, but I don't know whether it came through. Who actually wrote all the scripts? Would it have been rabbis or would it have been scribes?
More
Who wrote
likely
the actual
scribes.
text?
So more likely scribes, although there's a huge debate around literacy around the Cairo Genizah.
Mm.
There were even suggestions that maybe women could write,
Oh,
although
really? Oh,
so Goitin, who's the scholar who did most of the work on the mundane texts. We'll see him next time. We'll meet him next time. He always he said, this is women writing and so on. Modern scholars think that it's much more likely that that most people brought things to scribes, so that there were professionals. If you needed a letter written, you would go to the stall in the marketplace where the scribe sat. But probably not the rabbis. The rabbi's job probably wasn't to write. The Talmud is quite derogatory about scribes. The Talmud says, like, a good scribe doesn't understand what he's writing because that way he doesn't get tempted to falsify it or to correct it. So probably the rabbis wouldn't have done it, although some rabbis would have been scribes as well, probably.
Yes, I just wondered because, with Christian texts, it's the monks in the monasteries that did all the work. I wondered if they had, schools of religious scribes just doing this sort of thing under the supervision of the rabbis.
Probably not. I think it was probably much more sort of egalitarian in that sense.
Yes, freer and easier. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Rabbi Renee.
Yeah, first, thank you, Rabbi Leah, for this wonderful presentation. I think it's fascinating to look at these texts and to see that such a diversity and fluidity, in liturgy, for example, there's always this assumption that since the printed edition, in a way, everything became frozen, and therefore it became like, we've always done like this. But actually, when we look at these texts, we see that the reality was far from being frozen, and there are different versions, different traditions. I was thinking of this notion of the temple in this blessing of Yamida, the Babylonian version, which acknowledges the destruction of a temple, and the Palestinian tradition or version, which considers that the temple is still standing. And of course, they knew that the temple was destroyed, and it was destroyed before they actually started even the Geniza. But I was thinking, what kind of temple are we talking about? Because there's a whole theology of the third temple, and I don't know if it emerges already there, but this idea that the physical temple has been destroyed, but there is something, there's a heavenly temple, which probably is there's a blueprint or an echo, a model of a temple. Maybe it was referring to that ethereal temple.
Yeah, so I think so it's definitely possible that that was the case. There is also there's also a theory that they had many more ideas of different temples being around, that it wasn't right, because we now know from the Cairo Genizah also about the existence of the temple in Elephantine, which of course was also was already destroyed by that point, but therefore that the idea that there were temples around, they inherited the right that said there is still a temple, and yes, maybe it was like you said, they were imagining this sort of heavenly temple. Maybe it was that they considered their synagogues to be temples, just like the early Reform Jews who all called their synagogues temple. We don't know. We also don't know. The Babylonian right becomes very powerful, so the Palestinian right definitely dies out, and it's not clear whether people, whether some of these manuscripts had just been kept even before the Genizah, but weren't really used anymore. Maybe the liturgist collected them. And even though he was now already praying from the Babylonian prayer book, maybe he still had his Palestinian rite kind of for comparison purposes. We don't know.
Okay, I see. Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to dive into all of this. It's really, it is fabulous. And the fragments are so beautiful. There is also, I could have brought you, there is a prayer book that we think was Maimonides' prayer book. I didn't bring it to you because it's actually fairly late compared to some of the other texts. But really, I think there's a Haggadah which they think might have been Maimonides' Haggadah. So really, it's a treasure trove to find things.
Leo?
Yeah, David.
Can I just thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Leo,
very interesting. Yeah.
I wasn't here last week, so I didn't hear, and somebody may have asked already. Is it possible for you to arrange a trip for us to Cambridge?
So we can definitely do that. My assumption is we'll have to wait a little bit with the COVID restrictions.
Yeah.
But I know that a few years ago, Michael Hilton organized the trip. They're really, the scholars they love having people, and so we can definitely, I think once we can sort of move around a little bit more easily, it's quite easily accessible. From if you're in Northwood or even South London, it's not so bad to get there, and it is really beautiful, and they spend a lot of love and time with their visitors. So yes, absolutely. Anyone else?
Or we could go to Cairo. We could visit the Ben Ezra synagogue in Fustat.
Yes.
Very, very, very true. It might be a bit more of an expensive journey than Cambridge. And the good thing is I get free parking right by the Cairo Genizah collection, because my Cambridge college is the college that is right next to the library. And one of the benefits that alumni get is free parking. Which is very important in Cambridge.
Yeah.
But anyway, so really wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. And
Thank you, Leah.
Thank you.
next week we're
Thank
doing
you.
the mundane.
Thank you very much.
So, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.